Before we dive into tonight's story, I need to tell you about something. We've put together the Appalachian dossier, 7 documented cases from these mountains that we've never covered on the channel. Real cases, real evidence, real terror. The link is in the description. Now, let's get into the Whitlock family. You ever get the feeling that something's watching you, not just looking, but studying every move you make, learning your patterns, waiting for the exact right moment? Before we dive into this one, I want to know, have you ever experienced something you just couldn't explain? Something that made you question what's real? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, some of your stories are darker than anything I could make up. Now, let's talk about the Whitlock family, because what happened to them in the winter of 1927 is something that still doesn't make sense, no matter how many times you try to piece it together. This is a story about a family that vanished from a place they should never have been able to leave, and what was found in that house after they were gone sits in an evidence locker to this day, unexplained, untouched, and according to the one remaining witness who's still alive, better left that way. The year was 1927, deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the ridges cut so high they seemed to scrape the belly of the sky, and the valleys sit in shadow even at noon. There was a town there, or what passed for a town, called Thorn Hollow. Population maybe 200 on a good Sunday when folks came down from the hills for church. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and silence was survival, where people measured their lives not in years, but in winters survived and summers endured. The Whitlock family lived about 4 miles outside Thorn Hollow proper, up a winding dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and ice when it snowed. A road so steep in places you had to get out and push your wagon up the grade. Their house sat in a clearing carved out of dense forest, a 2-story timber structure with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the last light before the sun dropped behind the mountains. It had been built by Gideon's grandfather in 1873, back when the mountain was full of chestnut trees before the blight came and killed them all. The house had good bones, as they say, thick beams and solid joists, but it had a feeling to it, a weight in the air that visitors noticed immediately, and that the family had learned to ignore over the years. Gideon Whitlock was 43 years old that winter, a tall man with shoulders like an ox, and hands that had seen every kind of hard labor the mountains could offer. He'd worked in the coal mines until a collapse in 1922 took his hearing in his left ear and his faith in going underground. He'd been one of 17 men working the Blackwater seam when the timbers gave way. 12 men died. Gideon crawled out through a gap barely wide enough for his shoulders, dragging 2 other men with him, and swore he'd never go back down. After that, he turned to carpentry, building furniture and selling it in town, making just enough to keep his family fed and the house maintained. His hands were massive, scarred across the knuckles from years of close calls with saws and chisels, but capable of incredible precision when he worked. He could carve details into wood so fine you'd swear they were painted on. His wife, Temperance, was 38, a woman with sharp features and sharper instincts, the kind who could tell when a storm was coming 3 days before the sky showed a single cloud, who could look at a person once and know if they were lying. She kept the house, tended a garden that somehow thrived even in rocky soil, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see straight through to whatever you were hiding. People in town respected her but also kept their distance. There was something about Temperance that made folks uneasy, like she knew things she shouldn't, like she saw things in the corner of her vision that other people missed. They had 3 adult children still living at home. The oldest was Silas, 26, built like his father but quieter, more thoughtful, the kind of man who could spend an entire day working without saying more than 10 words. He worked alongside Gideon in the carpentry shop they'd built behind the house, spending his days shaving wood and sanding joints until his hands bled, then wrapping them in cloth and continuing. He was good at the work, maybe better than his father, with an intuitive understanding of how wood wanted to move, how grain patterns would respond to stress. He could look at a piece of timber and see the finished object inside it, then coax it out with his tools. Then there was Prudence, 23, who had her mother's sharp gaze and her father's stubbornness combined in a way that made her almost impossible to argue with. She helped with the house and the garden, but she also painted strange, abstract things that nobody in Thorn Hollow understood, but that she kept making anyway, covering canvas after canvas with swirling shapes and colors that seemed to move when you looked at them too long. She'd hang them in her room and stare at them for hours, like she was trying to decode something in the patterns. The youngest was Ephraim, 20 years old, the restless one, always talking about leaving for the city, about seeing something beyond these mountains that seemed to trap everyone who was born between them. He'd work for a few weeks, save up a little money, then spend it all on magazines from the city, reading about places he'd never been and lives he'd never lead. He was the dreamer of the family, which made what happened to him later all the more cruel. It started small, the way these things always do, with something so minor you'd dismiss it if you were smart. November of 1927, just after the first snow, Gideon came back from town one afternoon and mentioned to Temperance that old man Crowley, who ran the general store, had asked if everything was all right up at the Whitlock place. Gideon didn't think much of it. He said everything was fine, asked why Crowley was asking. Crowley had given him this look, this strange look, like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite bring himself to, and finally said he'd been hearing noises coming from that direction at night. Voices, he said, lots of voices, more than 5 people should make. Like there was a gathering happening up there, a meeting or a party or something. Gideon laughed it off. Sound travels funny in the mountains, he told Temperance. Echoes play tricks. You can hear a conversation happening 2 ridges over and think it's happening right next to you. She didn't laugh. She just looked at him with those sharp eyes and said, "Voices saying what?" Gideon didn't have an answer, because Crowley hadn't said. Crowley had just looked at him with this expression that was half concern and half fear, and said that whatever was happening up there, it wasn't normal, and maybe Gideon should look into it. A week later, Silas was working in the shop when he heard something moving in the trees. It was late afternoon, sun already dropping fast the way it does in November, shadows stretching long and thin across the clearing. He stopped his work, set down the plane he'd been using to smooth a table leg, and listened. Footsteps, he thought. Someone walking through the dried leaves and underbrush, not trying to be quiet, just walking with purpose. He called out, asked if anyone was there. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. Not even the wind, which was strange because there was always wind in those mountains, always some movement in the air. He waited, hammer in hand now, feeling his pulse in his throat. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they were circling, moving around the perimeter of the clearing in a slow, deliberate arc, keeping just inside the tree line where the shadows were thickest. Silas stepped out of the shop, looked into the trees, saw nothing but darkness between the trunks, darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. The footsteps continued steady, methodical, moving at exactly the pace a person would walk. He shouted again, louder this time, told whoever it was to show themselves, said he didn't appreciate being messed with. The footsteps stopped, and then, from somewhere deep in the trees, somewhere he couldn't see, he heard his own voice shout back the exact same words in the exact same tone. He ran inside, told his father what happened. Gideon grabbed his rifle, an old Winchester that had belonged to his father, and went out into the woods, Silas right behind him with a lantern. They searched until dark, found nothing. No tracks, no signs anyone had been there, not even broken branches or disturbed leaves. The ground looked untouched, like nobody had walked there in years. But that night, lying in bed, Silas heard it again. Footsteps outside his window, circling the house. He got up, looked out through the gap in the curtains. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of trees against the slightly less dark sky. The footsteps continued. He could hear them on the gravel, on the porch, on the wooden steps, each footfall distinct and clear. He woke his father. They went outside together, rifles loaded, Gideon with his, Silas with the old shotgun they kept for hunting. The footsteps stopped the moment they opened the door, cut off mid-step like someone had frozen in place. Gideon walked the perimeter of the house, checked every shadow, every corner, nothing. They went back inside. The footsteps started again before they'd even closed the door. This went on for 3 nights. Every night, the same thing. Footsteps circling the house, stopping when anyone went outside, resuming the moment the door closed. By the 3rd night, the whole family could hear them, 5 sets of ears confirming what one might have doubted. On the 4th night, Temperance heard voices. She woke Gideon around 2 in the morning, told him there were people talking outside, right outside the bedroom window. He listened. She was right. Multiple voices, low and indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot, like people whispering to each other, in a language that was almost, but not quite, English. He couldn't make out words, but he could hear the rhythm of speech, the rise and fall of sentences, the pauses where one speaker stopped and another began. He opened the door. Silence. He closed the door. The voices started again, closer now, like they'd moved up to the porch. He opened the door fast this time, trying to catch them. Silence. He stood there in the doorway, rifle raised, finger on the trigger, waiting. Nothing moved in the darkness. He closed the door. The voices came back, louder now, right outside the window. He threw the door open and fired a shot into the air, the gunshot shattering the silence, echoing across the mountains. The voices stopped. The echoes rolled away, fading into the distance. Then, from the trees, from multiple directions at once, he heard his own voice fire a shot into the air. The same sound, the same timing, like the mountain itself was mocking him. And already we're deep into something that doesn't make sense, something that violates the basic rules of how the world works. And it's only going to get stranger. But before we go further, let me ask you this. If you started hearing your own voice coming from the woods, copying everything you said, what would you do? Would you investigate or would you leave? Tell me in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious what you'd do in that situation. Also, this story is brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're enjoying this, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and if you're hearing this on some other channel, just know they stole our content without permission. Report them for us. Help us protect what we create. Now, back to the Whitlocks, because things are about to get much, much worse, and what happens next is the part that made the sheriff, years later, refuse to ever talk about this case again. December came, and with it came snow. Heavy, wet snow that piled up fast and made the road to town impassable within a day. The Whitlocks were snowed in, which wasn't unusual for that time of year in those mountains. They had supplies, firewood stacked high, enough to last a few weeks if they needed to, but the phenomena didn't stop. It escalated in ways that suggested intelligence, intention, like whatever was doing, this was learning, adapting, finding new ways to get under their skin. Prudence started seeing things in the windows. Faces, she said, pressed against the glass, looking in. She'd be sitting by the fire painting or reading, and she'd feel eyes on her, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. She'd look up, and there'd be a face in the window, pale, indistinct, gone the moment she focused on it, but there long enough to leave an impression. Not quite human, but shaped like human, like something that had seen humans but didn't quite understand how the features were supposed to fit together. She told her mother. Temperance believed her immediately because Temperance had started seeing them too. They were always at the edge of vision, never fully there when you looked directly. Shadows that moved wrong, that didn't match the light source, shapes that didn't match anything human, but somehow suggested something upright, watching, waiting. Ephraim, the youngest, started having dreams, terrible dreams, where he'd wake up convinced he'd left the house and walked into the woods. In the dreams, he'd follow a light, a soft blue light, that moved between the trees, always just ahead of him, leading him deeper and deeper into the forest. He'd walk for what felt like hours, the light always moving, always beckoning, and he'd follow even though some part of him knew he shouldn't, knew this was wrong. Sometimes in the dreams, he'd see other people following other lights, silent figures walking in the same direction, none of them acknowledging each other. He'd wake up in his bed, sweating, heart pounding, the dream so vivid he could still smell the pine and cold air, but his boots would be muddy, his clothes would smell like the forest, his feet would ache like he'd been walking. He started tying himself to the bed frame at night, using rope to bind his ankle to the post, terrified he was sleepwalking and the dreams were real. It didn't help. He'd still wake up with muddy boots, the rope mysteriously untied, coiled neatly on the floor beside the bed. The voices outside grew more distinct as December wore on. Temperance started recognizing them. Her mother's voice, calling her name, saying, "Temperance, come here, I need to show you something." In that exact tone, her mother had used when Temperance was young. Her mother had been dead for 12 years. Gideon heard his brother, the one who died in the mine collapse in 1922, the one he'd tried to save but couldn't reach in time. The voice would call out, "Gideon, help me, I'm trapped, I can't breathe." And Gideon would have to sit with his hands over his ears to block it out. Silas heard his childhood friend who drowned in the creek when they were young, the two of them swimming on a hot summer day when the friend got caught in a current and pulled under. Prudence heard a stillborn sister she'd never met but had been told about, a baby born 3 years before Prudence, born blue and silent. The voices called to them, spoke in familiar tones, said things only those people would know, referenced memories and moments that should have been private. It was psychological warfare, though they didn't have that term back then. It was something trying to break them down, trying to get them to open that door, to step outside, to come into the woods where the voices originated. They stopped going outside entirely. They boarded up the windows on the ground floor, nailing planks across the frames from the inside, blocking out the faces, the watching shadows. They kept the fires burning day and night, going through firewood faster than they should have. But none of them could stand the thought of darkness, of the fires going out and being left in the cold and dark with whatever was outside. They prayed. Gideon wasn't a religious man, had stopped going to church after the mine collapse when the preacher had said it was God's will and Gideon had nearly hit him. But he prayed anyway, because what else do you do when you're facing something you don't understand, something that doesn't follow the rules? The food started running low. By mid-December, they were rationing, eating once a day, trying to make supplies stretch until the snow melted enough to make the trip to town. Gideon knew they'd have to go eventually, knew they couldn't wait forever. But the snow was still too deep, and the phenomena outside showed no signs of stopping. Every night, the voices, every night, the footsteps, every night, the faces in the remaining unboarded windows upstairs. Then, on the night of December 18th, something changed. The voices stopped. The footsteps stopped. The faces in the windows disappeared. Complete silence descended on the house and the clearing, a silence so absolute it was almost painful after weeks of constant noise. The family waited, tense, expecting it to start again. It didn't. Hours passed. Nothing. Gideon carefully unboarded one of the windows, the nails screaming as he pulled them out, and looked outside. The snow was undisturbed, smooth and white in the moonlight, no tracks, no movement, nothing but the clearing and the trees and the white expanse of winter. He opened the front door, the hinges creaking. Cold air rushed in, but nothing else. No voices, no footsteps. He stepped outside onto the porch, rifle ready, every muscle tense. Nothing happened. He walked around the house, his boots crunching in the snow, the sound obscenely loud in the silence. Everything was still. Whatever had been tormenting them was gone, vanished as suddenly and completely as it had appeared. They waited another full day to be sure, jumping at every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind through the trees. But the phenomena didn't return. On the morning of December 20th, Gideon and Silas made the decision to go to town, get supplies, maybe talk to the sheriff, figure out what to do next. It took most of the day, trudging through snow that came up to their knees in places, sometimes up to their thighs where it had drifted. They reached Thorn Hollow as the sun was setting, went straight to the general store. Crowley was there, looked surprised to see them, actually stepped back like he'd seen ghosts. Asked if they were all right, said he'd been worried. Gideon said they were fine, just needed supplies. Crowley studied him for a long moment, then said, "You sure about that? Because I've been hearing things, strange things coming from your direction." Gideon asked, what kind of things? Crowley looked around like he was checking to make sure nobody else was listening, then leaned in close and said in a low voice, "Singing. Every night for the past 2 weeks, I've heard singing coming from up that mountain. A whole choir of voices, singing something I don't recognize, singing in a language I've never heard. And I grew up in these mountains, Gideon. I know every hymn, every folk song, every work tune. This ain't any of them." Gideon felt his stomach drop, felt something cold slide down his spine. They hadn't been singing. Nobody had been singing. He bought the supplies without another word, loaded them into the sled they'd brought, and they headed back. On the way, struggling through the snow and the growing darkness, Silas asked his father what they should do. Gideon didn't have an answer. They couldn't leave, not permanently. The house was all they had. Where would they go? How would they live? But staying was becoming impossible. When they got back to the house, it was full dark, the windows showing warm firelight from inside. They approached carefully, expecting something to be wrong, but everything looked normal. They went inside, stomping snow off their boots. Temperance, Prudence, and Ephraim were sitting by the fire looking relieved to see them, worry etched on their faces. Everything seemed fine. They unloaded the supplies, ate a real meal for the first time in days, meat and bread and vegetables that tasted like salvation after weeks of rationing. The night was quiet. No voices, no footsteps. They started to relax, started to think maybe it was over, maybe whatever had been haunting them had moved on or gotten bored or achieved whatever purpose it had. That night, around 3 a.m, Ephraim woke up to find his room freezing. His breath misted in the air in thick clouds, and he could see frost forming on the inside of his window. The fire in the main room was still burning. He could see the glow under his door, could hear the crackle of wood. But his room was ice cold, cold in a way that didn't make sense, cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He got up, went to the door. It wouldn't open. He pulled harder, putting his weight into it. It was stuck, or locked, though there was no lock on the inside of bedroom doors. He called out. No answer. He pounded on the door with both fists. Nothing. The house was silent, except for the fire. Then he heard something behind him, a voice, soft and familiar, his own voice, saying his name, Ephraim. He turned around slowly. Standing in the corner of his room, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was shaped like him, the same height, the same build. But it was wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the limbs too long, the movements too fluid, like it was wearing his shape but hadn't quite figured out how to inhabit it properly. It stepped forward, into the faint light from the gap under the door. It looked exactly like him now, same face, same eyes, same expression. It smiled, and the smile was wrong, too wide, too many teeth. Ephraim opened his mouth to scream. The family broke down his door, Gideon and Silas hitting it together with their shoulders until the frame splintered and found him unconscious on the floor, his skin ice cold, his lips blue. When he woke up, he couldn't speak. He just stared at the corner where the figure had been, shaking violently, tears streaming down his face, making sounds like a wounded animal. It took hours before he could tell them what he'd seen, and even then it came out in fragments, broken sentences that didn't quite connect. Gideon and Silas searched the room, found nothing. No sign anyone had been there, no footprints in the frost that had formed on the floor, nothing. But the room was still freezing, colder than it should have been, cold in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, like something had pulled all the heat out of the air and taken it away. That was the night they decided to leave. They'd wait until morning, pack what they could carry, and abandon the house. Go to town, stay with someone, figure out what to do from there. They couldn't live like this. Whatever was happening was escalating, getting bolder, and if they stayed much longer, someone was going to get seriously hurt or worse. They stayed together that night, all 5 of them in the main room, pushing furniture against the doors, keeping the fire high, waiting for dawn. None of them slept. They sat in silence, listening to the house creak and settle, jumping at every sound. Around 3 in the morning, the same time Ephraim had woken up, Prudence noticed something. The shadows on the wall weren't matching the firelight. They were moving independently, shifting and twisting in patterns that had nothing to do with the flames. She pointed it out. Everyone saw it. The shadows grew darker, more defined, pulling away from the walls and becoming 3-dimensional. They started forming shapes, human shapes, dozens of them all around the room, standing against the walls, silent, motionless, watching. Gideon grabbed his rifle, brought it up, aimed at the nearest one. The shape didn't move. He fired. The bullet hit the wall, punching a hole in the wood. The shadow didn't react, didn't flinch, just stood there. The shapes remained, silent, watching with whatever passed for eyes in those dark silhouettes. Then, slowly, they began to move. They stepped away from the walls, into the room, becoming more solid, more present. 3-dimensional now, no longer just shadows, but something with mass and substance, though still made of darkness, still without features. They had no faces, just blank voids where faces should be, but they moved like people, walked like people, their movements disturbingly natural. They surrounded the family, forming a circle that grew tighter and tighter. Gideon fired again and again, emptying the rifle. The bullets passed through the figures without effect, hitting the walls, the furniture, one shattering a window. Temperance started praying, loud, desperate, her voice rising into a shout. The figures kept coming closer, so close now that the family could feel the cold radiating from them, a cold like the grave, like frozen earth. And then the figures stopped. All at once, they froze mid-step. And then they spoke, all of them in unison, in voices the family recognized, their own voices. The figures said, "Come outside." The family didn't move, couldn't move, frozen in terror. The figures repeated it. "Come outside." Over and over, in perfect unison, dozens of voices all speaking together. The pressure in the room changed. The air felt thick, heavy, like breathing through water, like drowning while standing up. Gideon could feel something pulling at him, a physical sensation, like hands tugging at his clothes, his arms, his legs. He looked at his family. They were feeling it too. Ephraim was crying, tears running down his face. Prudence was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Silas had his eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer, hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. Temperance was gripping Gideon's arm so hard her nails drew blood, but he barely felt it. The figures spoke again, louder, more insistent. "Come outside." The pulling sensation grew stronger. Gideon felt his feet start to move, involuntary, dragging across the floor toward the door. He tried to stop. Couldn't. His body wasn't responding to his commands. The others were moving too, all of them pulled toward the door like puppets on strings, like marionettes being controlled by something they couldn't see. Gideon dropped his rifle, grabbed onto a chair, tried to anchor himself. The chair dragged with him, legs scraping across the floor. Temperance grabbed onto the mantel above the fireplace. Her fingers slipped on the smooth wood. They were almost at the door now, being pulled inexorably forward. The figures were all around them, pressing in, suffocating in their presence. The voices chanted in unison, mechanical, relentless. "Come outside, come outside, come outside." And then Silas did something that probably saved them all. He grabbed a burning log from the fire, hot enough that it seared his hands, and threw it at the door with all his strength. The door caught fire instantly, flames spreading faster than they should have, faster than was natural, consuming the wood, the frame, the walls around it, like they'd been soaked in kerosene. The pulling sensation stopped immediately. The figures recoiled, pulling back from the flames. The chanting cut off mid-word. The family collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, their muscles trembling from the strain of resisting. The fire spread, climbing the walls, racing across the ceiling. They had to move. They grabbed what they could, smashed out a window with a chair, and climbed through into the snow, tumbling out into the freezing night. Behind them, the house burned. They stood in the clearing, watching it go up, the flames lighting the night sky, orange and red and yellow, sparks spiraling up into the darkness like reverse stars. The heat was intense, even from 30 feet away, hot enough that the snow around the house melted, revealing dead grass underneath. They didn't try to save it. They didn't try to rescue anything. They just watched it burn, watched their home, their livelihood, everything they owned turn to ash and smoke. And around them, in the trees at the edge of the clearing, they could hear movement. Shapes circling in the darkness just beyond the reach of the firelight. But the shapes didn't come closer. They just watched as the house collapsed in on itself, the walls falling inward, the roof caving with a shower of sparks and a sound like thunder. The family stood there until dawn, until the fire had burned itself out and there was nothing left but smoldering timbers and ash, until the sun came up and revealed the full extent of the destruction. Have you ever had that moment where you realize you've lost everything, where everything you've built and worked for is just gone, and you don't even care because you're just happy to be alive? That's where the Whitlocks were in that moment, standing in the snow in their nightclothes, watching smoke rise from the ruins of their home and feeling nothing but relief. Drop a comment if you've ever had a moment like that, where survival was all that mattered, where you'd have given up anything just to make it through. Now, this is where the story takes a turn that still doesn't make sense, because what happened next is the part that made this case officially unsolved, the part that made the authorities close the file and refuse to discuss it, the part that, to this day, has no rational explanation. The Whitlocks made it to town late that morning, exhausted, frost-bitten, Traumatized, barely coherent, they went straight to the sheriff's office and told their story to Sheriff Horace Grimshaw, a man in his early 50s who'd seen just about everything these mountains could throw at a person but had never heard anything like this. He listened with increasing skepticism, his expression moving from concern to doubt to something like pity. He didn't believe them, not really, but he agreed to go up to the house and see what was left, document the fire, help them with whatever insurance or legal issues might arise. He took 2 deputies, men named Carter and Mills, and they made the trip that afternoon. The Whitlocks stayed in town, too shaken to go back, taking refuge in the church where the preacher's wife gave them food and blankets and asked no questions. What Grimshaw and his deputies found didn't match what the Whitlocks had described. Not even close. The house was still standing, completely intact. No fire damage, no broken windows, no signs of any destruction whatsoever. The door was closed. The windows were boarded up from the inside, exactly as the family had left them weeks ago. The snow around the house was undisturbed, except for the tracks Grimshaw and his men had made approaching. There were no tracks leading away from the house, no footprints in the snow showing where the family might have fled. Grimshaw stood there staring at the house for a full minute, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd been told. He called out, asking if anyone was inside. No answer. He approached cautiously, his hand on his revolver, the 2 deputies flanking him. He tried the door. It opened easily, not locked, not stuck. He pushed it open and stepped inside. What he found made no sense. Inside, everything was in place. The furniture was arranged normally. The supplies the family had bought 2 days ago were still on the shelves. The fire in the hearth was still smoldering, still warm, like someone had been tending it recently. There were 5 plates on the table, half-eaten meals still on them, forks laid across the plates like the family had been interrupted mid-bite. Beds upstairs were made with military precision. Clothes were folded and put away. Personal items were arranged neatly on shelves and dressers. It looked like the family had simply vanished in the middle of an ordinary day, like they'd been plucked out of existence mid-motion. Grimshaw searched the house top to bottom, the deputies with him, all 3 men increasingly unsettled by what they were finding. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry, no signs of anything unusual except for one thing. In every room, on every wall scratched into the wood in small, precise letters, were names. Hundreds of names, maybe thousands, carved in layers like sediment, some fresh and deep, some old and faded, some so old they were barely visible. Names Grimshaw recognized from town. People who'd lived in Thorn Hollow over the past 50 years. Names of people who died in the mines, who died of fever, who died in accidents. Names of people who disappeared, walked into the woods one day and never came back. Names of people who'd left town decades ago and never been heard from again. And at the very top of the list in the main room, carved in fresh wood, the letters still showing pale against the darker grain, were 5 names: Gideon Whitlock, Temperance Whitlock, Silas Whitlock, Prudence Whitlock, Ephraim Whitlock. Grimshaw stood there staring at those names, feeling something cold settle in his chest. He called the deputies over, showed them. They saw it too. This wasn't mass hysteria or group delusion. The names were there, carved deep, undeniable. He took photographs. though he knew they wouldn't show up well in the dim interior light. He made detailed notes, copying down as many names as he could, recognizing more and more of them as he went. He found names of his own relatives, people who'd died when he was young. He found the name of his first wife, who died in childbirth 20 years ago. Seeing her name carved into that wall in fresh wood made something in him go cold and tight. He left the house, told the deputies to seal it, board up the door from the outside, mark it as a crime scene, even though no crime had been committed that he could identify. Then he went back to town to talk to the Whitlocks again. He brought them back up to the house the next day, all 5 of them, Gideon and Temperance and the 3 children, still shaken, still traumatized. They stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the intact house, and it was like watching something break in them. "It's not possible," Gideon kept saying, his voice rising, becoming shrill. "We watched it burn. We stood right here and watched it burn to the ground." Temperance said the same thing, her sharp eyes wide and disbelieving. They all did, all 5 of them insisting that the house had burned, that they'd escaped through a window, that there was nothing left but ash. But the house was there, undamaged, exactly as it had been. Grimshaw asked them to come inside, show him where they'd seen the names carved into the walls. They refused. They wouldn't set foot in that house again, wouldn't even approach it. Gideon said if Grimshaw tried to make them go inside, he'd fight, and Grimshaw believed him. Eventually, after nearly an hour of arguing and pleading and threatening, Grimshaw gave up. He had the house officially boarded up, declared it unsafe for habitation, though he couldn't articulate why, and told the Whitlocks they'd have to find somewhere else to live. They stayed in town, renting rooms above the general store, trying to rebuild their lives from nothing. The town helped where it could, people donating clothes and food and money, but there was an undercurrent of fear, of people keeping their distance, of conversations stopping when the Whitlocks entered a room. Whatever had happened to them, people didn't want it spreading, didn't want to catch it like a disease. But things didn't get better for the family. They got worse. Silas started disappearing. He'd be standing there one moment talking or working or eating, and then he'd be gone. Not walking away, just gone, like he'd blinked out of existence. He'd turn up hours later, sometimes a mile away, sometimes in the woods outside town, with no memory of where he'd been or how he'd gotten there. He'd have dirt under his fingernails and scratches on his hands and the smell of pine on his clothes, but no memory. It happened 3 times in the first week, then started happening daily. Prudence stopped painting, stopped talking, just sat and stared at nothing for hours at a time. When people tried to talk to her, she wouldn't respond, wouldn't even acknowledge they were there. Her eyes tracked things nobody else could see, following movement across empty rooms. Ephraim became convinced that he was still in the house, that everything since the fire was a dream, that he'd never actually left, that he was still in his room with that thing that looked like him. He'd have episodes where he'd start screaming, clawing at his face, saying he needed to wake up, needed to get out. It took 3 men to hold him down during these episodes, and afterward he'd collapse, exhausted, and sleep for hours. And when he woke up, he'd be calm again, but distant, like part of him was somewhere else. Temperance grew thin and frail, her sharp eyes losing their focus, her sharp instincts failing. She'd forget where she was, forget who people were, forget her own name sometimes. And Gideon, strong, stubborn Gideon, who'd survived the mine collapse and built a life from nothing, started hearing the voices again. Everywhere he went, he heard them. His brother's voice calling from around corners, from behind closed doors, from the woods at the edge of town. He'd follow the voice, find nothing. It drove him to the edge of sanity, then pushed him over. By February of 1928, barely 2 months after they'd fled the house, the family was falling apart. The town doctor, a man named Everett, who'd seen his share of trauma and madness, suggested they leave Thorn Hollow entirely, go somewhere else, somewhere far away, start completely fresh where nobody knew them, and whatever had attached itself to them might not be able to follow. They agreed. They packed what little they had, accepted donations from the church and some of the kinder townsfolk, and prepared to leave on the morning of February 14th. That night, the night before they were supposed to leave, Gideon woke up in his rented room to find himself standing outside. He was in his nightclothes, barefoot in the snow, standing in the middle of the street. He didn't remember getting up, didn't remember leaving the room, didn't remember any of it. He looked around, disoriented, his feet already numb from the cold. The town was silent. No lights in any windows, no movement, no sounds of life. It felt abandoned, like everyone else had vanished and left him alone. He turned to go back inside and saw his family standing in the street with him, all 4 of them, Temperance, Silas, Prudence, Ephraim. They were in their nightclothes too, barefoot, standing in a line like soldiers at attention. They were staring at something. Gideon followed their gaze. At the end of the street, barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure, tall and thin and dressed in dark clothing that might have been black or might have been the absence of color, the absence of light. It stood perfectly still, and though it had no visible features, Gideon could feel it watching them. He called out, his voice cracking, asked who it was, what it wanted. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. He started walking toward it, his bare feet crunching in the snow, leaving bloody footprints behind him, though he couldn't feel the pain. The figure turned smoothly, mechanically, and walked away, disappearing around the corner of a building. Gideon followed, his family following him, none of them speaking, none of them able to stop. They rounded the corner. The street was empty. No figure, no tracks in the snow where it should have walked. Nothing. They stood there, confused, freezing, breath misting in the air. And then Ephraim pointed with one shaking hand. At the end of the next street, the figure was there again. Standing, watching, they followed. It disappeared. It appeared again, farther away. This went on. The figure always ahead of them, always just out of reach, leading them through the empty town, street after street, turn after turn, a maze with no solution. Finally, they reached the edge of town, where the road led up into the mountains, where the snow was deeper and untouched. The figure was standing there at the base of the road, waiting. It turned and started walking up the mountain, its movements smooth and unhurried. Gideon knew where it was going. He could feel it in his bones, could feel the destination pulling at him like gravity. He tried to stop, tried to turn back, planted his feet, and pushed against the invisible force. It didn't work. His feet kept moving, dragging forward against his will. The others were the same, all of them trying to resist, all of them failing. They followed the figure up the mountain, through the snow, in the freezing night, barefoot and bleeding and unable to stop. They walked for hours, the figure always ahead of them, never looking back, never slowing. None of them spoke. They couldn't. It was like their voices had been taken, like their ability to produce sound had been removed. Eventually, after what felt like forever, they reached the clearing. The house was there, dark and silent, exactly as it had been, windows boarded from the inside, door closed. The figure walked straight to the front door, opened it with one smooth motion, and stepped inside. The door remained open, a rectangle of deeper darkness against the dark of the night. The family stood at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming at them to run, to flee, to do anything but go inside. But they couldn't move backward. They could only move forward, one by one, like a procession. They walked through the door into the darkness. Sheriff Grimshaw found evidence they'd been there 3 days later. He'd been checking on the house periodically, uneasy about leaving it abandoned, and this time he found something wrong. The boards on the door had been removed from the inside, nails pulled out, wood stacked neatly beside the entrance. The door was slightly ajar. He called out, got no response, pushed the door open with his boot. Inside, he found wet footprints on the floor, 5 sets, different sizes, barefoot. The prints led from the front door, through the main room, up the stairs, and into the bedrooms. He followed them, his revolver drawn, calling out the whole time. The footprints led into each bedroom and stopped in the middle of the room, just stopped, like the people making them had vanished mid-step, had been plucked out of existence. On the table in the main room, he found a note. It was written on a scrap of paper in Gideon's handwriting, shaky and irregular, barely legible. It said, "They wanted us back. We don't know why. We never knew why. If you're reading this, don't look for us. Don't come here at night. Don't follow the voices. Don't follow the lights. They're not us anymore. They were never us. There's something else, something that wears our shapes, that uses our voices. Tell our story. Make sure people know. Don't let them be forgotten. Don't let this place be forgotten." Grimshaw organized a search party. 20 men, the largest group that could be assembled from Thorn Hollow and the surrounding areas. They scoured the house, the woods, the clearing, the surrounding area for miles in every direction. They brought dogs, tracking hounds that were good at finding people in the wilderness. The dogs refused to enter the clearing. They'd get to the edge of the trees, smell something, and start whining, pulling back on their leashes, wanting to leave. The men searched anyway for 3 days straight, covering every inch of ground. They found nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle, no clothing, no indication where the family had gone or what had happened to them. It was like they'd walked into that house and ceased to exist, like they'd stepped through a door into somewhere else, somewhere the search party couldn't follow. The case went cold. Grimshaw filed his report, documented everything he'd found, included the photographs of the names on the walls, included Gideon's note, and sealed the file. The house was torn down in 1932 by order of the county. The land left vacant and unused. The timber from the house was supposed to be sold, but nobody would buy it. It sat in a pile for years until it rotted and was eventually buried. But even after the house was gone, demolished and removed, people reported seeing lights in the clearing at night. Not just 1 or 2 people, but dozens over the years. Lights that moved between the trees, blue and soft, like lantern light, but colder. And they reported hearing voices. 5 voices singing in harmony, a song nobody recognized, words nobody could understand. The town of Thorn Hollow slowly emptied out over the next 2 decades, population declining year by year. People left, moving to cities, moving to other towns, anywhere but there. By 1950, Thorn Hollow was a ghost town, maybe 20 people left, mostly old folks who'd been born there and refused to leave. The official records say it was economic decline, the coal mines closing, lack of opportunity. But the locals who remained, the ones who'd lived there through everything, told a different story. They said people left because of the voices, because at night, if you listened carefully, you could hear Thorn Hollow singing. Hundreds of voices, all the people who'd ever disappeared, all the names carved into the walls of that house, all singing together in that strange language. And if you followed the sound, if you let curiosity override common sense, you'd find yourself on that mountain road, walking toward a clearing that shouldn't exist anymore, toward a house that had been demolished decades ago, but was somehow still there if you knew how to look for it. In 1956, a team of researchers from the University of Kentucky went to investigate the Thorn Hollow area as part of a study on abandoned Appalachian settlements, on ghost towns, and why they failed. They set up camp in the clearing where the Whitlock house had been, not knowing the history, not knowing what had happened there. On their 3rd night, they recorded audio as part of their documentation, standard practice for field research. The recording still exists, stored in the university archives, labeled and filed, and mostly forgotten. It's 10 minutes and 47 seconds of silence, just the sounds of wind and distant animals and the rustling of trees, and then voices. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, singing in perfect harmony. The song goes on for 3 minutes and 12 seconds, then stops abruptly mid-note. The researchers packed up and left the next morning, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of equipment, leaving their notes and recordings behind in their rush to get out. They refused to talk about what they'd experienced, signing non-disclosure agreements with the university, except to say in their official report that they'd heard their own names in the singing, heard voices that sounded like their mothers and fathers and siblings and friends, all calling to them, all asking them to come closer, to step into the trees, to follow the lights. The recording was labeled as an audio anomaly and filed away. The investigation was quietly closed. The university issued a statement saying the area had been deemed unsafe for research purposes due to unstable terrain and potential environmental hazards. To this day, nobody officially goes to that clearing. The locals won't even talk about it. The few people who still live in what's left of Thorn Hollow, and there are maybe a dozen now, old and stubborn and too poor to leave, they won't discuss the Whitlocks. If you ask about them, they'll change the subject or tell you they don't know anything about it. But if you press them, if you really insist, if you catch them in the right mood and offer them enough money or enough whiskey, they'll tell you one thing. They'll tell you that some places have a gravity to them, a pull that's stronger than reason, stronger than fear, stronger than the survival instinct. And once that pull gets hold of you, once it sinks its hooks in deep, there's no escaping it. You can run, you can hide, you can go to the other side of the world, but eventually you'll feel it calling you back. Eventually you'll find yourself walking toward it, unable to stop, unable to resist. The Whitlocks were pulled back to that house, back to that clearing, back to whatever was waiting for them there. And they're still there, in some form, in some way we don't understand and probably can't understand. Not dead, not exactly, not alive, not in any way that makes sense, but present, existing, singing in that clearing that still exists somewhere between what is and what shouldn't be. And every name carved into those walls, every person who disappeared from Thorn Hollow over the decades, they're there too. All of them together, all singing the same song, all waiting for more voices to join them. Sheriff Grimshaw, before he died in 1962, told his grandson something about the case. He said that, in all his years as a lawman, in all the things he'd seen in these mountains, the Whitlock case was the only one that truly terrified him, because it suggested that there are doors in this world, thresholds you can cross without realizing, and once you're on the other side, there's no coming back. And the worst part, he said, the thing that kept him up at night for the rest of his life, was that he'd heard the singing too. On quiet nights, when the wind was right, he'd hear it drifting down from the mountains. And sometimes, just sometimes, he'd hear his own name in there, sung in his dead wife's voice, calling him home. So what do you think happened to the Whitlock family? Do you believe some places can trap people, can pull them back no matter how far they run? Do you believe there are thresholds in this world that lead somewhere else, somewhere we're not meant to go? Tell me in the comments. And if you got a story about a place you couldn't escape, a place that felt wrong, a place that called to you in ways you couldn't explain, share it with us. It might be our next video. We read everything, we listened to everything, and who knows, maybe your story is connected to something bigger, something that's been happening for longer than any of us realize. Stay with us for the next one. Until then, keep the lights on.